After my grandparents died, I inherited $26 million. My parents demanded it when I refused. Asterisk. Hey guys, before we start today's video, I need your help. I have noticed that the channel is losing traction and subscribing is one of the best way that you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thank you very much. I never thought the day would come when the quiet comfort of my grandparents' old farmhouse would feel so empty, so cold, and yet so suffocatingly full of memories that I could hardly breathe. They had been my rock for as long as I could remember, especially during those years when my parents seemed too busy chasing their own ambitions to notice that I was growing up without their warmth. My grandparents were the ones who packed my school lunches, who listened to my endless questions, who made me feel like my existence mattered more than any meeting, any party, or any material thing. Losing them was like losing the last safe place in my life, and when I stood at the lawyer's office to hear the reading of their will, I wasn't thinking about money or property or anything of that sort. I was thinking about them, about how much I'd give to have just one more cup of tea at that wobbly kitchen table with Grandma humming softly and Grandpa telling one of his terrible but endearing jokes. But as the lawyer's words spilled out, my grief was interrupted by something I could never have prepared for. $26 million. The number echoed in my mind like a foreign language, strange and unreal. My grandparents had never flaunted wealth. They lived simply, wore old clothes, and fixed broken things rather than replacing them. And yet, here it was, this enormous sum they had apparently accumulated quietly over the years in business land, businesses I'd never known about. They had left it all to me, not to my parents, not split between relatives, but to me alone. The shock made my stomach knot, and I could already imagine the storm it would cause. My parents were there, sitting a few seats away, and I saw the flicker in my mother's eyes, the way my father's posture stiffened. It was the kind of change you could almost feel in the air, like a cold wind sweeping through a room. They didn't even wait for the meeting to end before my father leaned forward and whispered, in that tone he used when he wanted to sound concerned, but was really just demanding, "You'll know what to do with that money, won't you?" At first, I didn't understand. But then his meaning settled in. He wasn't asking. He was telling me that the money should go to them, and that was the moment my life shifted from grief to a whole new kind of battle. I remember driving home that evening with the weight of the inheritance sitting in my mind like a heavy stone, and the silence in my car felt different, as though even the air knew my life had just changed in a way I wasn't ready for. My phone buzzed constantly, my parents calling, texting, sending little "we need to talk" messages. But I ignored them at first because I needed to breathe, to think, to figure out what my grandparents had wanted me to do. I kept hearing Grandma's voice in my head, telling me when I was younger, "Money shows you who people really are, darling, and sometimes it's the people you least expect." I didn't understand her back then, but the truth in those words was starting to sting. By the next morning, my parents were at my apartment without warning. They didn't even knock. Politely just rang the bell like they were owed my time and my space. My mother walked in first, with that familiar air of entitlement she'd carried all my life, and my father followed close behind, his jaw tight, eyes sharp. There was no "how are you holding up?" or "we're so sorry about your loss." No, the first thing out of my mother's mouth was, "We think it's only right you hand over the inheritance. We can invest it properly, use it to help the family." Her words dripped with this false sense of logic, as though my grandparents hadn't made a clear decision. I told them gently at first that my grandparents had left it to me for a reason, that they trusted me to handle it. But my father's voice grew louder, harsher, insisting that I was too young, too inexperienced, that it wasn't fair for me to hoard that kind of wealth when they had worked so hard their whole lives. I could feel my chest tightening, not just from the confrontation, but from the realization that this wasn't going to end with one conversation. My refusal only seemed to feed their anger, and my father, in a tone I had never heard before, said, "You owe us. Don't forget everything we've done for you." It hit me then this wasn't about family. It wasn't about love or guidance. It was about control, about claiming something they believed should have been theirs all along. And as much as it hurt, I knew that giving in would mean losing more than just money. It would mean losing the independence my grandparents had fought to give me. Over the next few weeks, the tension with my parents escalated into something I had never experienced before: calls at all hours, unexpected visits, relatives suddenly checking in on me with forced smiles that couldn't quite hide their curiosity, and social media posts from distant cousins vaguely hinting about family greed. It was as if my entire extended family had been given a script, and the opening line was, "Make her feel guilty until she gives in." I stopped answering the door, stopped picking up unknown numbers, and even started avoiding certain places I used to love, because I knew there was a chance I'd run into someone who'd tried to corner me about the inheritance. I remember one particularly awful afternoon when my mother showed up at my work. She walked straight past the receptionist, ignoring the protests, and into my office like she owned the place. She shut the door and stood there with her arms crossed, staring at me with this cold, calculated expression. "You're making a fool of yourself," she said. "People are talking. Do you really want to ruin your relationship with your parents over money?" I looked at her and felt this strange mix of sadness and anger, because she didn't seem to realize, or maybe didn't care, that the relationship she was trying to save had already been fractured by her actions. When I told her again that the money was staying with me, she didn't yell, she didn't cry, she just leaned closer and whispered, "You'll regret this." The words chilled me more than if she had screamed. That night, I got an email from my father, and it wasn't written like a message from a parent to a child. It was a legal threat. He had spoken to a lawyer, he said, and there might be a way to contest the will. My hands shook as I read it, not because I was afraid of losing the money, but because I couldn't believe how quickly love could turn into hostility. My grandparents had raised me to be kind, to be fair, to respect family, but they had also taught me to stand firm when something mattered. And deep down, I knew this was one of those moments where giving in would mean betraying not only myself, but also the trust my grandparents had placed in me when they made their final wishes. The breaking point came on a rainy Saturday afternoon, the kind of day when the sky feels heavy and the streets are slick with puddles that reflect every passing car light like fractured glass. I had just settled into my couch with a blanket, thinking maybe I could finally have a quiet day, when the pounding on my door started. Not knocking, pounding. My stomach dropped before I even looked through the peephole. My parents were standing there, drenched from the rain, their faces set in matching masks of determination. I almost didn't open the door, but some stubborn part of me refused to hide in my own home. As soon as I let them in, my father started pacing like a caged animal, while my mother went straight to the point. "We've decided this has gone on long enough," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the sound of rain tapping against the windows. She pulled out a folder and placed it on my coffee table with a dramatic flourish. Inside were documents, papers I recognized as legal forms, with highlighted sections and sticky notes scrawled in my father's handwriting. "Sign these," my father said flatly. "This transfers the funds to us so we can manage them. You'll still get an allowance, enough to live comfortably." My hands curled into fists before I even realized it. An allowance. They wanted to control everything, down to how much I could spend on groceries. I told them, in no uncertain terms, that I wasn't signing anything, that my grandparents had left the money to me because they trusted me, not them. My father's face turned a shade of red I'd never seen before, and he slammed his hand against the table so hard the coffee mugs rattled. My mother, on the other hand, went eerily calm. She sat back, crossed her legs, and said, "If you think you can keep it all, you're more naive than I thought. We'll drag you through court until you have nothing left, not even the will, to fight." The words hit me like ice water. I realized in that moment that whatever love they had for me was now completely entangled with their desire for control and greed. They weren't going to back down. But neither was I. And as they stormed out into the rain, slamming the door behind them, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would protect what my grandparents had given me, no matter how ugly this got, even if it meant standing completely alone. The weeks that followed were some of the most exhausting of my life, a blur of legal consultations, tense phone calls, and the constant, low-level anxiety that comes from knowing people you once loved are now actively working against you. I hired a lawyer, one my grandparents had used in the past, a man they had trusted implicitly, and when I explained everything, he looked me in the eye and said, "Your grandparents were very clear in their intentions. This money is yours, and we will make sure it stays that way." It was the first time in weeks I felt a real sense of relief, though it was fragile and easily shaken whenever another email from my parents arrived, each one colder than the last. They didn't ask how I was doing anymore. Didn't mention memories or shared moments, just legal threats and accusations of selfishness. Friends tried to comfort me, telling me I was doing the right thing, but there were nights I lay awake, wondering if I had made some terrible mistake, if maybe keeping the money really did make me the villain in this story. But then I'd think about my grandparents, how they had raised me to be independent, to think for myself, to protect what mattered, and I'd know in my bones that I was honoring them by standing firm. The legal process was slow, but in the end, the will was upheld without question. My parents didn't get a cent. When the decision came through, I sat in my apartment with the rain tapping softly against the windows, the same way it had on that awful day they brought the papers, and I felt a complicated mix of victory and grief. I hadn't just lost my grandparents, I had lost the illusion that my parents' love was unconditional. I thought I might feel triumphant, but mostly I felt a quiet, bittersweet peace. I knew I would use the money wisely, not just for myself, but to help causes my grandparents cared about, to keep their legacy alive in a way that no one else in the family had bothered to. And as I wrote the first donation check in their name, I whispered a thank you into the empty room, imagining them somewhere together, smiling down on me, not because I had $26 million, but because I had finally learned the hardest, most important lesson they ever tried to teach me, that some things are worth protecting, even if it costs you the people you once thought would stand by you forever.